Hello everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. It has been a while because I've been a little bit busy. I've been running around the country, Canada in this case, trying to figure out a pretty interesting mystery. And if I can't contain my excitement on tonight's show, it's because I think we maybe have found something. There's actually a little bit of history that we might have been able to explain as we go through this entire hour, or maybe it'll be less than an hour. Certainly going to try to keep it to 30 minutes if we can. It all started when earlier this month, we were able to lock down a big exclusive. We were able to confirm through an impeccable source, I might add, that Jeffrey Epstein worked for Israeli military intelligence. And then 2 weeks ago, we were able to add another source to that reporting that confirmed what the first guy had told us, which was that Jeffrey Epstein worked for Israeli military intelligence. It's been our biggest exclusive yet, at least in the last 2.5 years that Narativ has been alive. And it's given us a little bit of a calling card. We can sort of get into some doors. Some people will talk to us now because we have that information and because still unmatched by anybody, by the way. Nobody's matched this reporting yet. We think is 100% correct that Jeffrey Epstein worked for Israeli military intelligence. It all has huge implications, of course, for what's going on in the world today. But it also sort of makes you look at history a little bit differently. Because, as you know, Jeffrey Epstein had a close relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell. And Ghislaine Maxwell's father was Robert Maxwell, who is the famed British media tycoon, who was also an Israeli spy and also worked for the Russians, worked for the KGB. So there's a bit of a circle going on there. And we're going to try and unpack this in a very interesting way. So Robert Maxwell, while he was being a spy for the KGB and the Israelis, and maybe who knows who else, was also at the center of probably the biggest shift in politics in the last, I'd say 100 years. Some people might argue it's less, but certainly I think one of the biggest in the last century. And that is the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union. Robert Maxwell was squarely in the middle of all of that. And we'll find out a little bit in the way how today in today's show. If we had a DeLorean, and I've always wanted to have a DeLorean, the kind that they have in the Back to the Future movies. Remember that guy, the big crazy professor, Michael J. Fox, that movie? They used to go into the DeLorean, press the button, and magically be transported back to 1987 in this case. Well, if I had one, I'd take us back to the 28th of May, 1987. I don't, but I do have archives, and we'll let that be for today. Matias Rust was just 19 years old in 1987 when he single-handedly flew the Cessna plane from Helsinki to Moscow's Red Square. It's a 500-mile distance, by the way, successfully evading Soviet air defenses at the time. It was huge news. No one had ever thought that they would be so easy to access or get past. Now, the teen at first couldn't find Red Square. Then when he finally did find it, he had trouble finding a spot to land because there were so many people on the ground. He finally did find a spot. It was on a bridge nearby, and he was met by a lot of very happy Muscovites, and he was happy to meet them too.
Yes, but as vice chief, but I need 2 years for the teaching license.
Rust's 500-mile flight to Red Square on his Cessna eventually cost him 14 months in jail. And although it may have been a teenager prank, or so people thought, it did have very real-life consequences for Gorbachev's key military leaders.
Rust's 500-mile flight through Russian air defenses won him international notoriety. But it also led to the removal of Gorbachev's defense minister and the biggest shakeup of the Soviet military since the 1950s.
Rust maintains until today that he did the right thing because he helped pave the way for glasnost and perestroika.
I think my flight to Moscow helped to bring both sides closer to each other. Gorbachev was able to replace important officials with men of his favor. This, I'm very convinced, enabled him to push his perestroika and glasnost much faster forward than he most likely would be able to have done without me to arrive in Moscow.
So, what a remarkable story. I'm sure you'll agree. I remember that day quite well because it was unusual to see anyone flying into Red Square. Certainly not a teenager, on a white Cessna just arriving, gently landing in the middle of Red Square is not something you expected to see on television in the height of the Cold War. And yet here it was happening before our very eyes. Until this last week, that's all we knew, that there was this brave teenager that did this thing, that did this historic event, that just decided to fly all the way into Red Square. But it turns out we might have been a little naive, and history may need to be adjusted, because it wasn't just a prank by a German teen. It was part of a very complex set of intelligence operations that involved the United States, involved the Israelis, and also involved parts of the Russian KGB. And that ultimately all led to the fall of the Soviet Union. So that little flight, big flight maybe, had a huge impact on what happened in the next couple of years between 1987 and 1989, the end of the Soviet Union. And there were a few other things that happened around that time that you want to look at and say, well, if that was an intelligence operation, maybe these things were also intelligence operations. Now, the first one was definitely an intelligence operation. It was the arrest of Jonathan Pollard. Happened in 1987, arrested for spying on behalf of the Israelis on the United States. He was a naval intelligence officer, and he got access to a lot of key files. He shared them with the Israelis, and he also shared them with the Soviets. So you can sort of see a pattern developing here. Here was Pollard on 60 Minutes.
There is no excuse
For what you did.
for the breaking of a law. Never. There is an explanation, however. Not an excuse, but an explanation.
And that explanation is?
The hard reason why I did what I did was because I had become aware of Mr. Weinberger's agenda in Washington with regard to Israel.
Which was to abandon Israel? Is that the point that you're making?
It was fundamentally to place Israel in a position where she would be forced to make an unenviable choice between a ruinous war or shameful peace.
So you can see that Israel feels pretty, in historic terms at least, allowed in its own self-interest to do whatever it deems necessary to perhaps spy on its close ally, the United States. And it's happened a few times. And again, we're reminded of Epstein and Maxwell and their roles in history. And as we'll play out this series in the next few weeks, we'll figure out a lot more, I think, about what Epstein really did on behalf of the Israelis in the United States. 1987 was also interesting for a couple of other reasons. It was the first time, that we know of, that Donald Trump and his then wife, Ivana, had a little trip to Red Square. That's where they met some officials about doing some business in Russia. And it is also the time, we believe, that the KGB were seriously assessing Mr. Trump as a possible KGB asset. That was 1987, same year as Matias Rust's flight, same year as Pollard was arrested. And then 2 years later, Donald Trump shows up on the yacht of Robert Maxwell. There he was, along with many other famous people, including Senator John Tower, who plays a big role in all of this. But Robert Maxwell invited Donald Trump to his yacht in 1989. And that's been a particularly interesting early point of contact between the Trumps and the Maxwells. And as we know, that lasted on for decades. Now, it is well known, I think at least, that Maxwell was a spy for the Israelis. He was possibly killed by the Israelis for wanting to reveal their secrets. And when he was killed, possibly by, we don't know, but possibly by lethal injection, while he was on his yacht off the Gran Canaria Islands. And we know that he's been associated with the Israelis for many years in terms of business, in terms of other things that he's done for Israel. But he was also a KGB asset. And we know this by going through the incredible vault release that the FBI dumped a while ago about Maxwell. And in that vault, we've discovered a lot of documents which clearly point out that at least the FBI suspected Maxwell was working on behalf of the KGB. According to this one document, T1, who's the source, related that Maxwell and Steiner, I think. I don't know if that's correct. Wallensteiner. Anyhow, it's Kurt Wallenstein, if I'm not mistaken, were in contact with the Russians in East Germany, who were prepared to facilitate trading by their companies with Eastern Bloc countries in return for certain intelligence information. And so it's not that unusual, I will say, because that's how intelligence sort of works. You get information, you get something in return. So we'll send you some whatever it is you need, parts for your aircraft. In exchange, you'll give us some information about what's going on behind the scenes. That's sort of the way things work in the intelligence community. And in this particular case, We know the KGB were interested in a lot of stuff coming out of the United States, but they were also interested in trading information about what was going on. And the FBI was onto these guys. They tracked them everywhere they went. And so we have a pretty good record of how Maxwell was working for the KGB at the time. So, what happened next was probably one of the most significant events in history that is just underrated because it deals with software, and everyone thinks software is kind of boring and it's hard to explain, but it isn't. This particular piece of software, known as Promise, probably played one of the most significant roles in changing history of all time. And Promise was a very interesting database compilation tool. It basically did something that no other piece of software had ever done before. And Robert Maxwell was instrumental in getting that particular piece of software outside of the Justice Department in the United States and into the hands of the Russians. Let's learn a little bit more about this. Promise made it possible for prosecutors to track any case through the US court systems. The underlying code was truly pioneering. Promise allowed data from different databases to be combined into a single data set for analysis. At the time, there was just simply nothing like it for tracking people, money, and cargo. So, decades before Edward Snowden revealed the NSA was spying on basically everybody, American intelligence already had the software to do it. Ronald Reagan believed Promise was his secret weapon to bring down the Soviet Union. But how do you get Promise into the hands of the Russians? Well, in 1983, or so the story goes, Rafi Eitan, an Israeli spy master operating under a pseudonym, stole a copy of Promise from its creator, Bill Hamilton of Inslaw. Eitan gave the software to Ari Ben-Menashe, his partner in the spy ring, also from Israeli military intelligence, and then he gave it to Robert Maxwell, the British media tycoon and double KGB and Israeli agent, who gave it to the Russians. Hamilton and Ben-Menashe blew the lid off the spy caper on Australian TV.
He allowed the CIA to spy on the intelligence agencies that bought it.
So many people in the last 10 years, due to cover-ups, died mysteriously.
Modifications that enabled it to key in a special access code and gain entry to all the information on the computer.
Would be equivalent to reading the handwritten files of all the agents, except the computer has them neatly organized and typed and instantly indexed, so it's much more convenient.
So that's Bill Hamilton. I've been speaking to him via email and we're getting a lot of interesting information. The other guy you saw in that video clip was Ari Ben-Menashe, who I traveled to Montreal to spend some time with and found it a fascinating couple of hours. I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today as a little teaser of the stuff that's coming up in the next few weeks. So just to catch you up, because it is a little complicated, Israel steals the software from the Department of Justice and they sell it to Russia, America's, biggest adversary in the world. It should cause major ruptures. It should not turn out to be the end of the Soviet Union. You would think it would be a big win for the Soviet Union. Only we know it wasn't, because there was a backdoor that the Americans had installed in that Russian software, or in that software that landed up with the Russians, that allowed the Americans to spy on the Russian spy agencies. So just over a week ago, I got a call. Ari Ben-Menashe's on the phone, and he's saying, I will talk to you after all your endless requests. Come over to Montreal, let's have a sit down. So, by the way, he no longer works for the Israelis. He does run a private consultancy with some, I should say, shadier kinds of clients. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to Ben-Menashe's work, but when Robert Mugabe is a client and the South Sudanese government are also your clients, you're beginning to build a roster of people who are mainly known for their despotic acts. However, I'm sure there's a good reason for why they might need a consultancy and a consultant like Ari Ben-Menashe. He also still gets an occasional check from the Russians, by the way, so keep that in mind as you're listening to this, because he does some consulting work for the Russians in the Ukraine. I certainly kept all of it in mind because I walked into this loft in Old Montreal and I'm like, okay, this is interesting because the body man, Sergei, is pretty large, and there he is. Very nice guy, I have to say. But still, it made an impact. And then there was a lawyer present, which I don't normally get lawyers in interviews. I don't really get interviews like this before. But I kept that all in mind. I kept it in the back of my mind that perhaps there is a good reason why they're being a little cautious on this particular story. I've been told by many journalists who've interviewed Ari Ben-Menashe be careful. He leads people astray. He gives people misleading information. He won't answer your questions. And it's pretty obvious that he's very, very good at doing just exactly that. But as you're watching this, keep me in check. Let me know what I'm doing wrong or right, or what he's evading or not evading, by contacting me either on DM or elsewhere. So let me just make sure that everything's doing what I need to do here. The interview lasted 2 hours, as I mentioned. We're just going to play a little bit today, because as we were talking, Promise came up, and it led me to a really interesting line of questioning. And I'll tell you all about that. Take a listen for now. Promise, for example, the software Promise.
Yeah.
Maxwell was involved in that too.
Yeah, we were the ones that gave it to him, and he gave it to the Russians.
And sold it to everybody else around the world.
Yeah, but the Russians was important.
Rafi Eitan, who passed away recently. What do
Which Rafi Eitan? There are two of them. There was the one chief of staff of the army, and there's Rafi.
There was the one who was.
Lakat.
There was the Promise one is what I'm thinking about. Yeah. Who was the other person that went with him to get the software from the Department of Justice? Who was with him? Because there was two people, right?
I know Hamilton and his wife pretty well.
You do?
Are they still around?
I think so. How did that happen that you knew them and you still did this operation?
At the time, we were interested, but Hamilton, just so you know, get it, did not design his Promise software as a civilian, and this is where they got everybody misunderstood it. Yes, Hamilton was involved in writing the program, or helping write the program, but he was part of
Department of Justice.
The government.
Yeah.
At the time.
Right. They just wrote it in that he could own it, and so it was. Yeah. But it was his legally. It was his. But it wasn't.
Sure it was his.
It certainly wasn't the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis just went in.
No. It wasn't Israeli. It wasn't Israeli.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was American. It was probably owned by the National Security Agency.
Yeah.
Because he was working before he became a private person. He was in Vietnam.
Signals.
He was a signals person in Vietnam.
Interesting. I didn't know that. But for sure he worked at the Department of Justice, and for sure that was where he developed it. But this extraordinary brave act of Rafi and whoever it was to go and get this in that undercover. And then to give it to Maxwell. Why did you give it to Maxwell?
So we'd sell it to the Russians.
So you would make some money as well, or
no, it isn't about making money. Remember the flight that landed in Red Square?
So I'm going to pause it there for a second, because it does get really interesting. He explains exactly how that flight to Red Square was part of an intelligence operation, and we'll get to that in a second. But the core of what he was saying was that the reason that Maxwell was given the software, and ultimately the reason it was given to the Russians, had everything to do with bringing down the Soviet Union, or at least the communist rule of the Soviet Union. And it's remarkable to keep that in mind as we rethink a little bit about what Maxwell's history was all about. The other thing that really struck me as I was listening to him talk there, while he was talking about Rafi Eitan, something went off in my head, and I was like, I remember reading there were two people, not one person. All the reports that I could find online talk about just a single person going in there, masquerading as Dr. Ben-Or, and that person turns out to be Rafi Eitan, the spy master, and that he somehow, through a negotiation, I think, gets his hands on this software and then takes it away, gives it to Ari Ben-Menashe, and then ultimately gives it to Robert Maxwell. Now, if there were two people, the likely other person who would be there would be the person I was sitting in front of, which is Ari Ben-Menashe. So I asked, and he didn't quite give me the answer. I asked again, and he didn't quite give me the answer in that little bit we heard there. So I let it go because I wasn't going to ruin the rest of the interview by making some sort of claim that was completely untrue. But when I left, I made a call to Bill Hamilton, and I asked Mr. Hamilton pretty directly if Rafi was alone that day, because if he wasn't alone, and Ari Ben-Menashe was there, then Hamilton knew Ben-Menashe, and then the whole thing wouldn't hold up. The whole ruse that this was some sort of theft, whatever, wouldn't have held up, because if they know each other, he would have just said, hey, you're the guy from Israeli Intel, right? This is what Hamilton said to me regarding Rafi Eitan on that day. And this is all by email. He won't talk in person. So I assume it's actually the real Bill Hamilton. And I assume it's not, some sort of bot or machine impersonating him, although it does feel sometimes like I'm getting answers that have been regurgitated. But here he says, Rafi Eitan visited Inslow's office in downtown Washington, D.C. in February 1983. Under the guise of being an actual Israeli military of justice official, the name of Dr. Ben-Or. He met first with me, that's Hamilton, and I later had another Inslow employee spend an hour or so demonstrating promise to him. He was not accompanied by anybody else. But Ben-Menashe did indicate, in that little bit you heard from me, that he sort of was that other person. He didn't say bluntly, yes, there was another person, but he didn't say he wasn't the other person. He didn't say there wasn't another person at all. On Ben-Menashe, Hamilton has this to say. I first heard about Ari Ben-Menashe in 1991. That's 7 years after the theft of the software. And Hamilton says he arranged to meet him in Lexington, Kentucky, after his release from the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. Interesting that he was in jail for 13 months there for selling U.S. helicopters to the Iranians as part of the Iran-Contra scandal. Hamilton goes on to say, do I trust him? No, but I would not trust any clandestine intelligence operative for any government, because lying and cheating is part of their official duties. So you're led to believe, firstly, that Hamilton, just because he, maybe encountered Ben-Menashe through an individual, goes to Kentucky of all places to meet Ben-Menashe after he gets off from his little prison sentence. It doesn't strike me as being particularly accurate. And, as I'm reading the rest of that statement, it occurs to me that maybe Hamilton himself is one of these clandestine intelligence operatives who might be lying and cheating as part of their official duties, because there's a couple of facts that just don't line up. It does seem to me, at the end of the day, that Ben-Menashe was the guy who went with Rafi Eitan to get that software to pick it up. And if he was, it would have been known to everybody that he was part of military intelligence for the Israelis, and therefore it wouldn't have been a theft. It would have been just an organized handover, which would have meant the Americans were really in on this. The Americans were in on the idea that they were going to give a compromised version of promise to the Russians so they could spy on the Russians. But I can't make that claim just willy-nilly. I had to call Ari again. That's it, cap in hand, and say, can you just answer a couple more questions about what happened on the day? So here he is, as bluntly as I could, and this is a bit of an edited version, but he confirms this a few times, where he reveals to Narativ exclusively that he was the guy with Rafi Eitan in 1983. I'd asked you before if you were with Rafi Eitan when he got the software. Were you there with him at the time?
Yeah.
How did you introduce yourself?
My name is Ari Ben-Menashe, and I never used the number.
And did Rafi Eitan use another name?
I really don't remember because
So I think he says at the end there he had a pseudonym, which of course he did have a pseudonym. We know that he went in as Dr. Ben-Or, but he would never have gone in as Dr. Ben-Or if his partner was going in as Ari Ben-Menashe, because everyone knew, or at least Hamilton knew, that Ari Ben-Menashe worked for Israeli intelligence. So why fake Eitan's identity? If they were both working for military intelligence, just go in there and grab your stuff. By the way, there's a lot of archive documents as well that prove that the Americans were certainly facilitating a handover, but we've never heard it like this from one of the participants, as far as I'm aware. And I think we can maybe correct a little bit of history here and say that Ben-Menashe and Rafi Eitan were there. However, it's just one guy as a source. Rafi Eitan is dead. I'm relying on Hamilton saying that he wasn't, and there are some archive documents which we can share later on that sort of indicate that that's the case, which is really interesting stuff if you are a geek like me, because it is fascinating to me that the way these intelligence organizations work together is not always as clear as people on the outside think it is. We look at alliances like the one between Israel and America as being like just a pure alliance. They would never work with the Russians. And yet we know they do work with the Russians. And there are times when you work with your enemies, times when you work with your friends in order to achieve different interests for your country. And maybe what happened in 1987 is a lot like what happened in 2016, when it seems like the Russians and the Israelis operated against America in installing a government here, the Trump administration. All of that is entirely possible, and it's where we're heading to next as we continue our investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. And the rest of this interview is just really, really interesting stuff. What we'll find out, of course, is a lot about Jeffrey Epstein, because Ben-Menashe was the handler, was Maxwell's handler for a good 10 years, maybe a little less, as they were trading arms and doing a bunch of other things for the Israelis and the Russians, and selling arms to the Iranians, which, as we know, didn't end well for Ben-Menashe, who spent 13 months in prison. I would say goodbye, but I'd be remiss, because you're still wondering, what about that plane? How does the plane, the white plane, Matias Rust's plane, landing in Red Square, how does it all tie in to this incredible mystery? Here's the answer.
Remember the flight that landed in Red Square? German boy that landed in Red Square.
Yes. I do remember that,
Flew.
Yeah.
A promise was sold to the GRU. And the Israelis and everybody knew what was in their bags.
Right.
To test the information, they had this young man fly and land. Everybody took it as a big joke.
Oh.
And he lands straight in Red Square.
Intelligence operation?
Yeah, of course it was an intelligence
Amazing.
operation. To see if thing. And he landed without even being detected. He was only detected when suddenly people see a small airplane landing in Red Square.
So Promise would have been able to pick that up?
No. What Promise picked up was where the radars were and the anti-aircraft missiles were.
Right. So they were using that as a database, as data source.
That's right.
So it was sold to the GRU with the intention of it being used as with the back door, so people could spy into the GRU.
That's right.
So it was sold on purpose in order to spy on the Russians.
That's right.
And that is one of the ways the Russian Soviets, the communists in charge of Russia, were booted out of power, because the Americans were able to spy on a lot of what the Russians were using to maintain their military power. And whether that was equipment or other things, it was a very tough time for Russia to be able to maintain that power. They needed to get things in very underhand ways. And the Americans knew everything that was going on because they had given them Promise, which seemed like such a fantastic piece of software. So the Russians took it. And then to test the whole thing, the Americans and the Germans fly Matias Rust on this Cessna, a 500-mile journey, and they wait to be detected, and they wait for Promise to detect Matias Rust's arrival in Red Square, and it just doesn't get detected because their air defenses are so weak. It all leads to the end of a couple of military careers. Gorbachev gets a much more moderate, liberal military leadership. And the rest, as they say, is history, but there's a lot more that is yet to be told. And there are so many interesting parallels with what we have been going through since 2016 that it just kind of is fascinating. It boggles my mind. My thanks to Ari Ben-Menashe for spending some time with me. Sometimes in this line of work, you get to spend some time with some really interesting people, and he certainly is one of them. And there are just not that many people who can shed light on Jeffrey Epstein and on Robert Maxwell, and Ari Ben-Menashe is one of them. So I thank him for his time, for spending time with the Narrative. We have a lot more of this interview. It gets really, really interesting, and we'll tell you more about that in the coming weeks. We want to remind you that you can always support our work at Narativ. And when I say our, I know I'm solo now, but it doesn't mean I'm doing all this work alone. We have terrific people who support me and us in every way. So John Bernstein, who you got to follow on Twitter, the guy's a font of information at Bernstein 1985, has helped a lot with the research and development of this particular line of inquiry for Narativ. I want to thank Lincoln's Bible, as always, who's been a terrific asset, and it just always has tons of information at her fingertips, or his fingertips. And I also want to say thank you to you, because it's a lot to get on a plane, to get to Montreal, to spend time traveling, spend the money traveling, and we can't do that. I can't do that without your support on Patreon. So patreon.com/Narativ. Your subscription starts at $3, and I hope you think it's worth it, because we're shedding some light on some territory that has been hidden in the shadows for a very, very long time. A reminder as well, we're a podcast. So now Narativ Live is a podcast. You can find it on iTunes in the podcast store. You can find it on Google Play in the podcast store. Please go there, download, subscribe, follow us. Every little bit helps in building Narativ up as a news brand. And that's our show for tonight. I want to thank you for joining us. We will be back. I've got a part 2 on this particular topic, which explores the history of Israel and Russia coming together as a military intelligence operation. And that's all coming up in next week's episode. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great night.